Welcome to the EMS on AIR Podcast. The mission of this podcast is to keep healthcare providers safe, informed, and prepared. Today is May 3, 2021. This episode was recorded on February 24, 2021. I'm Jeff Lassers, and I'll be your host. Even though we're located in Southeast Michigan, and we mention our home state a lot, today's content applies to EMS on the national and even the global scale. Today, we welcome Dr. Sam Mishra back to the show. Sam is the EMS for Children Coordinator for the state of Michigan. Today, my buddy Sam has brought along the founders of Carter Kits, which is an amazing organization that is helping first responders understand, appreciate, and care for children with autism and other special needs in a way that best serves the child and their family. Carter Kits sensory bags contain items known to comfort and appropriately focus children who are on the autism spectrum, as well as many other children who occasionally find themselves overwhelmed or otherwise impacted by traumatic events. In 2019, Carter Kits began as a grassroots call to action, embodied by a simple text message sent by Justin Sievers, a detective at Saginaw Township Police Department here in Michigan. The text was sent to his friend Brandon Hausbeck, the training officer at the Saginaw Fire Department, and another friend, Andrew Keller, a realtor in Frankenmuth, Michigan. The text read, "We need a tool to help us when we arrive at a scene with a special needs child." Justin's son Carter has autism, and he is the inspiration of their organization. Justin's idea was to equip as many police, fire, and EMS vehicles as possible with the means to calm distressed children like Carter when arriving on scene. Andrew reached out to a family friend, Dr. Ellen Preen, a clinical neuropsychologist who has both a daughter with autism spectrum disorder and extensive experience working with individuals impacted by autism, trauma, anxiety, depression, and learning challenges. Together, Andrew, Justin, Brandon, and Dr. Preen saw the need to expand the scope of their efforts to any child in crisis who may benefit from the contents of a Carter Kits sensory bag. For more information, visit carterkits.com. That's CARTERKITS.com. In this episode, our guests will help us appreciate being prepared for pediatric emergencies, as well as the value of EMS provider education about autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. Then, we discuss the intent and purpose of Carter Kits and how you can implement them into your EMS agency or system. You can find each of our guests' email addresses in the episode description. Please keep emailing your questions, comments, feedback, and episode ideas to the EMS On Air podcast team by email at qi@ocmca.org. Also, check out our website, emsonair.com, for the latest information, podcast episodes, and other details. Follow us on Instagram at EMS On Air, and please, whatever podcast platform you use, subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and a review. Thank you for listening to the EMS On Air podcast. Enjoy the episode. Dr. Mishra, welcome back to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. The sun is out, so I'm feeling much better.
The sun is out, and I didn't have to shovel today. Thank you very much. We're also here with Brandon Hausbeck, where I'm going to introduce you here soon, and Justin Sievers. But before we introduce them, Dr. Mishra, can you please remind everybody who you are, what you do, and where you do it?
Sure thing. So I'm Sam Mishra. I am the EMS for Children Coordinator, and currently that position is housed over at BETP, or the Bureau of EMS Trauma and Preparedness, sometimes lovingly called the EMS office. And basically that's where I am, and I just get to advocate for improved readiness to take care of kids every day.
Awesome. Now there's a lot of previous episodes you can check out with Dr. Mishra. But before you do that, let's introduce you to Brandon Hausbeck. Brandon, can you introduce who you are, what you do, and where you do it?
Sir, thank you. My name is Brandon Hausbeck, Training and Safety Officer with the Saginaw Fire Department, and I'm also a managing partner for Carter Kits, which we're going to talk about here pretty soon.
Well, welcome to the show. Justin Sievers, Detective Sievers. Welcome to the show. Please, same questions. Who are you? What do you do and where do you do it?
Hey, good morning. My name is Justin Sievers. I'm a detective with Saginaw Township Police Department here in Michigan, and I'm also a managing partner with Carter Kits with Brandon.
Before we get into the meat of what Carter Kits is and what you guys have done to really help and support children with autism spectrum disorder, Let's start with the primary focus of really why we bring Dr. Mishra into the fold here, and that's to be prepared for pediatric emergencies. And as a reminder, an EMS for Children program is represented in every U.S. state and territory. So there's a Dr. Mishra in your state. You just got to find out who that is. And every one of those people is essentially there to help you, the EMS provider, get prepared for that awful pediatric emergency. Justin and Brandon, give us your take on the necessity of preparation for first responders and pediatric emergencies.
Thank you, Jeff. I think that for a long time, the first responder community has lagged a little bit with their response to those on the autism spectrum. And we're just finally starting to get some information out there, some training and some equipment, which is exciting because I know that when I started with the fire department, I had no clue how to identify those who were maybe on the spectrum, who would take to emergency scenes a little bit differently than maybe myself. So we're working on improving this every single day, and that's the mission of Carter Kits, but we still have a long way to go. But it's very encouraging to see that there's so many groups out there. And, obviously Dr. Mishra from the state has been huge, getting that buy-in at the state level and with a lot of different communities. Obviously with Oakland County, Jeff, you've been integral with that. And that's our mission, is to kind of from community to community get this buy-in and continue to train and prepare our first responders for those interactions.
That's very well stated, sir, and I couldn't agree with you more. Justin, can you add to that, please?
Yeah, I know on the law enforcement side, especially here in Saginaw Township, we respond to all the medicals that go out. So when EMS shows up on scene, typically we're on before they are. So it's important for us to be able to identify these situations and know how to deal with them. So that way we have a lifelong rapport with these, children or even adults with autism. It's just very important that we build that rapport. That way, the next time we go out there, they know who we are and that we're not there to hurt them.
Yeah, that's so important. Dr. Mishra, it's so important for us to be prepared. We know that. That's your job. So what's the value of EMS provider education about autism spectrum disorder?
Well, if you didn't just ask the perfect question, right now we're talking about a topic, autism spectrum disorders. We're talking about something that might make people uncomfortable, that some people might not have a lot of experience in. We certainly don't get a lot of training in any of the healthcare avenues, myself included. I don't feel like I got training on this topic the way I should or maybe could have in medical school. When it comes down to it, when we don't talk about things that make us uncomfortable or maybe push our limits, we're not growing. And so we're not going to do the best that we can for the people that we see who have needs that are different than our own, whether it's autism spectrum disorder or anything else that you don't see all the time. If you don't start talking about it or ask questions or find resources, we're not going to be able to do the best we can for these kids. And that's really the whole point of talking today with Justin and Brandon, and learning not only about autism spectrum disorder, but also what we can do for the children and their families to make sure that they have as positive of an experience as possible during an emergency or an encounter, and what we can do as providers to do better the next time that we have such an encounter. And I consider myself very, very lucky that I got to meet Brandon and Justin because they truly have a passion for helping their peers, but also for helping children and families go through these experiences and hopefully have a little less trauma and fear and anxiety when they come out on the other side. So yeah, I just think it's a crucial conversation to have, and it really helps us be better providers and take care of these kids.
Thank you very much. Before we move on, can you help us define and describe autism spectrum disorder for those that truly don't understand? Let's hear it from the doc.
I would rather actually hear from Brandon or Justin because there are experts here. They've really sought out not only learning about what defines autism spectrum disorder, but also a lot of the caveats and nuance that mean a lot to a provider who encounters a child with a spectrum disorder in the field. And I think that's really, really crucial. So I'd love to actually turn it over to them and hear from them.
Let's go ahead and start with you, Justin.
Yeah, prior to having Carter, who's diagnosed with autism, as a first responder, I spent 10 years not really knowing anything about it until Carter was diagnosed. That's when it came to the forefront, and I started learning about it and realized that we as first responders have no training in how to deal with these situations, let alone how to identify. So in 2016, my youngest child, Carter, who was 2 years old at the time, was diagnosed with autism. We knew he had some communication barriers, and at the time he could only say 2 words, which were up and go. We had an autism evaluation done, which obviously I don't want to say it was hard, but it was, as a parent, it's kind of discerning. You're kind of wondering what's going to happen to your child if he gets, I guess, labeled as having autism. How's other kids going to treat him? How's he going to get through life? Because as a parent, you obviously want the best for your children. You don't want them to have to deal with all the stuff that the world has going on today. So when Carter was diagnosed with autism, obviously it was hard for us to hear, but that's when it really opened up for us. And we're like, well, let's make the best of it. And there's nothing we can change. There's a reason. And that reason came December 12th of 2019 when we introduced these Carter kits to first responders, which we can get on in a little bit here. But for me, not knowing about autism, it was nice that we were offered parent training at the Covenant Center for Autism where Carter went. We would go in and we would meet with the behavioral therapist, and they would introduce us to autism. We would watch the other children. We would watch Carter interact with these therapists, and they would teach us how to deal with things. And it was nice because we would do certain events where we would go to a restaurant one day just to see how Carter would react with other people around and teach him how to interact with other people out there dealing at restaurants. And we would take him to the zoo, and a lot of interactions and introducing them to the world and teaching us parents how to deal with these situations.
Autism is a disorder that is characterized by certain traits. Dr. Mishra, can you help us with those real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to get real technical, which I'm going to do for the sake of making sure we're all starting on the same page here, and I'm actually going to go right to the diagnostic criteria that is used in the DSM-5. So for anyone who's not familiar, this is kind of like the gold standard for anything that you can think of when it comes to psychology. And so that makes sure that we're all on the same page and we define things the same way. And to talk about autism spectrum disorder, you need to consider the fact that these individuals do have persistent deficits in social communication and interaction across multiple contexts. So this is not just one little caveat. This is a very nuanced set of disorders. And that's why it's called a spectrum, because some things may seem very mild to some people or may seem very severe and can limit an individual's ability to interact with others, especially in social circumstances, the way that you may take for granted. And so that's really important to remember, is that it's right there in the title. It's called a spectrum. So there's a whole array of symptoms, manifestations, traits that you may notice. And if you take any sort of autism training, you'll get to learn a lot more about those nuances. But some of the most important things to remember are that these individuals may have restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So things may seem rigid to you, or a child or an individual may seem like they're repeating themselves, or an action or an inaction, and may just kind of make you scratch your head. It may not be obvious, but these are some of the most common things that you can identify.
That helps very much. Thank you very much. And the reason I wanted you to define that and kind of give those characteristics was because Justin was just describing how he had to learn to teach his son in a way that he could learn to interact with the world around him. But how he perceives the world is so different than his dad. Not to say anybody's normal, it's just different than his dad. And so Justin had to go through an education process of, I'm a grown adult, and now I need to relearn how this human being learns so that I can arm this human being to interact with the world in a positive way and have a great life, because that's the whole point.
You just hit the nail on the head there, Jeff. And so one thing I would love to highlight here is perception. So at the end of the day, an individual with a spectrum disorder just perceives the world, communication, stimulus, they perceive it differently than some of us do. And so if we keep in mind that a bright light to us might indicate it's time to wake up, it's sunshine, let's go, to an individual with a spectrum disorder, a bright light could be painful. It could be overwhelming. It could be scary, especially if you're 2, 3, 4 years old and you don't have any way to understand what an adult yammering at you is trying to tell you to calm you down. That might just be amping you up. So if we just take a pause and we think to ourselves, the perception, the stimulus that comes into our brain is just processed entirely differently if you are on the spectrum, it makes it easier to put yourselves in their shoes and think about, why is my intervention as a first responder not being received the way I think it is going to be received? But in the heat of the moment, that's very hard to do. That's very challenging because we are trained to respond. We're trained to take care of people and to take control of a situation. So if somebody doesn't respond the way that we expect them to, it can lead to really frustrating situations for the first responder, the child, the parent, and we can end up making things worse or more challenging for ourselves. And so that is why learning about the crux of autism spectrum disorders helps us do better when we encounter such a situation.
Justin, what Dr. Mishra just described is basically the benefit of being prepared for that event. And as a parent, you became more prepared through that education process. Once you had a better understanding of autism spectrum disorder and then were able to be provided with tools to help your son, how much did that impact him? Did it make his stimulus coming in easier for him to manage and interact with the world?
Yeah, definitely. I look back at, there was a time we tried to take him to the circus at the Dow Event Center, and he lasted maybe 2 minutes. And I had to take him home and come back later and pick up my wife and other kid because Carter couldn't handle it. I mean, he was just screaming because there were so many people. However, a year later, we take him to a Saginaw Spirit game. He had a little squishy ball with him, which is a stimulus, and he sat through the entire game. He watched the entire game with us, and he enjoyed it. So just having that little bit of stimulus with him allowed him to sit through the entire game.
And that is the magic, right? Understanding the person that you're communicating with in a way that you can both get on the same page. And that's an event that's fun. The circus is fun. A spirit game's fun. But what about when things aren't so fun? Like they fell down and now this kid's got a busted leg because kids like to climb things. He fell off the counter, whatever. They get hurt and now you're dealing with this medical emergency. Now there's these really bright lights and a siren outside and 2 to 6 people coming into your house wearing these uniforms that may seem to be scary, and now they're wearing masks. So it seems like what you learned through that process, you probably went, hey, when these types of human beings who perceive the world one way are interacting in a bad circumstance, they probably need different forms of communication and care than I would when I fall down and get hurt.
Absolutely. I mean, like you mentioned, it's stimulus overload. You got these lights and sirens, and especially in a fire situation, you look how when they show up in their turnout gear, it's scary to these kids. But if we have one good interaction with these kids, it lasts a lifetime. They do not forget things. And I look back now and I think of calls that I've went on with children with autism and how I could have done things differently. And would that have changed how they perceive police or fire now if I could have done things differently, if I would have known back then?
Man, knowing is half the battle, right? Didn't we grow up with that?
Absolutely.
I'll never forget that. And knowing is half the battle. And it really is. Like, if you got to walk away with one cartoon message ever, that's a pretty good one from G.I. Joe. I know it's violence and stuff, but I mean, they were right. Oh, okay. So being prepared and knowing is huge. So how did you transition to Carter Kits?
Actually, it was a text message between myself, Brandon Hosbeck, and Andrew Keller, he owns JMW Real Estate in Frankenmuth. And we were just talking one day, and I asked Brandon, the whole police and fire banter. I was joking with him, and I says, hey, how come your department isn't cool and have something that can help these kids? And Andrew, being as generous as he is, says, well, why don't we? So he got with me, and we kind of put things together, and Brandon had some insight into what we were going to do. And Andrew put 10 of these kits together. December 12th, 2019, we donated them to 5 local agencies, fire department, police, and EMS here in Saginaw County. And Andrew paid the money. He fronted everything. And once that hit the news, it was insane. The need we definitely seen. Andrew said he wanted to have 50 of these kits out within 1 year of December 12th, 2019. And we've got several hundred of them out now. once we saw the need, it was very heartwarming knowing that we've definitely hit something that we needed to fulfill.
Okay, so you recognized that you could provide these kits, right? And we'll get into what's in the kits here in a minute. And the whole intention here is to reduce that crazy time for that kid stimulus coming in and just winding them up to a point where they don't know they're actually being helped.
Absolutely.
And so you just basically talked enough smack to your friends to guilt them into fixing the problem. And I tip my cap to you, sir. Well done. I have friends that do that to me too. And so, all right, Brandon, your buddy texts you. You're like, all right, message received. Let's get this done. What happens then?
Well, when Justin kind of came up with the idea, I was all on board because, Justin's a friend of mine. His family's a friend of me and my wife, and we love Carter. Carter's a great kid, and a light bulb clicked with me thinking, wow, yeah, we can really make a difference here, and we can do it, in honor or at least because of Carter. I've been to enough conferences and things around the state and around the country, fire conferences, to know that there just isn't much of this out there. There's a few departments here and there that have maybe tried to put their own kit together, but they found that it's very expensive to do. So I thought for sure for us, we could meet the need of getting the equipment out there to these departments and hopefully doing it a lot cheaper for them. I'm not a businessman. I don't think Justin's a businessman either. So we really didn't know what we were getting into or how we could accomplish it. But one thing that all of us share, the partners, is that we're very determined. And when we find something that means a lot to us, which this obviously does, we go all in. And so that's what we did. And we started learning, we started researching, and we were able to put these kits together at a very attractive price for departments. Obviously, everyone's budgets are cut and they're low, and we get that. Me coming from a fire department, I get it. So we were able to get all these items together, get the kits together. The one thing we lacked, though, was at this point, it was really 3 individuals who just had good intentions. Justin obviously had the most experience with autism because of Carter, but we felt like we still did not have that clinical background. Then we were introduced to Dr. Ellen Preen, who is a family friend of Andrew Keller's fiance. And Dr. Preen is a clinical neuropsychologist. She specializes with autism. Those who have autism, she's researched it. She's an expert in her field. So with the relationship that Andrew and his fiance Meg have with Dr. Preen, that gave us the opportunity to reach out to her, see what her thoughts were. And just like the 3 of us, she was all in. She loved the idea. She thought it was great. She thought it would meet a need that was not currently being met. And she came on board. And so what she did is she basically went through and decided with her clinical experience what items should be in the kit and why they should be in there. Once we determined that, once we got that completed, then we started moving into the training sector, because obviously it's one thing to have the equipment, but if you don't know how to use it, it's useless. And this is actually where Dr. Mishra comes in. I was researching things around the state of Michigan. I was trying to get our message out there of, how can we make an impact? And I came across the website for the EMS for Children program. Dr. Mishra's information was there, and I like to think that I'm a pretty personable person. So I was like, I'm going to reach out and just see what she thinks. And it was an amazing impulse, I guess. Sam's been just beyond words amazing for this mission and for us. But she really pushed. She's like, the training is going to be integral here. And with Dr. Preen, having already mentioned it, it further solidified our mission of, yes, you are correct. We need not only the equipment, but the training. And so Dr. Mishra helped us, as far as getting the training out. We're on My Train for the state of Michigan, which anyone who's in the EMS realm knows what My Train is. Police and fire are also involved with My Train. So really it allowed us to get our message, our training program out to all of these first responders. Especially with COVID, it's a very convenient way because it's all virtual.
When you guys realized what you wanted to do, you knew you wanted a kit, and you knew the general idea what you wanted in it. You identified that Dr. Preen was an expert and that Dr. Preen could identify the specific tools and the reasons why with data to support those reasons. So can you walk us through each one of those items?
The items in the kit, we have 5 items. Dr. Mishra spoke about the autism spectrum and some of the telltale signs, so to speak. And that's something I learned pretty quickly, was that no two people are the same. And, that goes for everybody, right? But on the spectrum, children, people, they're all different. Just like, I'm different from you, Jeff. You may have one individual who is nonverbal. There might be another individual who is very hyposensitive, another's hypersensitive. What causes them to be hypo versus hyper? So you really have to determine on an individual basis with the individual that you're helping, you're dealing with, what makes them tick? What is their stimulus, so to speak? So the 5 items we have, the first one is a nonverbal communication card. And we felt that was important because for those who are nonverbal that are on the spectrum, they're not going to be able to tell you this hurts or I need this help or my mom is over here. So we needed this card, and Dr. Preen was instrumental in creating it. So basically, anyone who's nonverbal can point to the different items that are on the card, and they can tell us as first responders that they need help. Do they need an ambulance? Do they need a police officer? There's also items on there. Maybe it's as simple as they're hungry or they're thirsty. They can point to that and say, I'm thirsty. And there's also a pathway for them to understand, and Dr. Preen was very adamant about this, a pathway for them to understand that, yes, they're going to get the help they need, whether it's EMS, police, fire, but then that's ultimately going to result in them going home. And for them, that is a big key, is understanding, it's scary if you have to go to the hospital or you have to go to the police station or whatnot, but giving them that connection so they understand that it's going to ultimately result in them returning home, returning to what they know, their safe place. Moving on in the kit, we also have some earmuffs in there. And these come in for those that are hypersensitive. Really, anytime we're talking about someone who's hypersensitive, they're overreactive. So they're seeking calm, they're seeking quiet. So we can use the earmuffs to help them shut out all the noise of the outside world, which, in our case could be sirens, people congregating, anything like that. We have a 24-piece toy kit. This comes in for those who are hyposensitive. Those would be individuals who are underreactive and are seeking stimuli. So if there's a child who needs to keep themselves occupied, we have that 24-piece kit. And we designed the kit the way we did because some children focus on some items versus others. For one, it may be a squeeze ball. I know Justin says that, that's one of Carter's favorite things is he has that ball he can squeeze. And for another child, it might be a different item. So again, it's tailoring it to the individual. We also have sunglasses in the kit, which go kind of along with the earmuffs for a hypersensitive individual. If they don't like the bright lights, they don't like the flashing lights, we can give them the sunglasses, and it helps darken things down and basically take them out of the situation. And if you think about sometimes when you play with children and you cover your eyes and they think you can't see them or they can't see you, and it's the same type of thing. I won't say a placebo effect, but sometimes when they put the sunglasses on, they feel like you can't see them or they feel invisible, and it helps with that as well. The last item that we have in there is the weighted blanket. And this comes in for actually both hypo and hyper. There's a lot of research out there on the benefits of weighted blankets, and I think anyone who's used them probably understands that. But we found that it comes in very handy. It can help the individual feel secure, feel safe. It helps distance themselves from whatever's going on around them. And it also provides that weight of security.
Thank you very much. Now that I've learned a little bit more about autism spectrum disorder, those items almost seem obvious to me, but now I know, right? So if you don't know, you're going to be like, well, what would I give this person? So it's interesting that it takes so much time and energy to get through the clinical information to identify these very simple tools that make a very simple answer in a very critical situation. I'm working very hard here locally in Oakland County to get a Carter kit on every single licensed EMS unit in our whole county. So that's 50 agencies. And the idea is every time somebody calls 911, there's a Carter kit on scene, at least one. That's where we want to get to. That's not always available to countywide systems with so many agencies, and we have a lot of resources. And the biggest resource we have in Oakland County is people who care. So for me, it's going to be a little bit easy. It's not always easy for other agencies or systems. So let's get into implementing Carter kits into an agency. Brandon, Justin, what does it take for a police department or an EMS agency and or a fire department to say, hey, we want to adopt this concept and assure that we are prepared for pediatric emergencies for kids that are on the autism spectrum?
Well, we obviously want to get the kits as widespread as we can. all it takes is an agency contacting us and saying, hey, we want some kits. Now, the number one issue that prevents agencies from doing that is obviously cost. And that was the key when we first started. Like I mentioned earlier, we wanted to make sure that we could make these affordable. The items that are in there, when you're talking about weighted blankets and things like that, they obviously get a little expensive. But we were able to secure some large group purchasing plans, worked with some of the vendors out there to get prices as low as we could. And that's how we're able to get these kits out for $79.99 a piece. And some agencies have come to us and just paid directly out of their budget if they can, which is great, but that's not always an option. So what we have found very beneficial is partnering with businesses, nonprofits, other groups like that that are in the community. A lot of times these groups love these causes. So police, fire, EMS department goes to a business or goes to a nonprofit and says, hey, we really want to get these in our department, but we don't have the budget. Can you help us? And we've seen that happen time and again where these businesses and these groups have stepped up and done so. I love to see it. It's amazing. Everybody is pitching in and doing their part. So we want to get them as widespread as we can.
So all you got to do is have the budget to purchase them. You would probably give them away for free if you could, but you don't have the budget just to make that happen. Before, I do want to ask one quick question here, and I think I know the answer to this, but you want to get a Carter kit in as many agencies as possible, not because money's going into your pocket, correct? This is a foundation. This is a mission-driven situation. This is not a business you guys have, correct?
Correct. When we first started, we did not have any funding whatsoever. And so for us, it was a long process. Like I say, we are not businessmen, and it was a lot of learning. But we worked with an attorney, and we had to set up an LLC for two reasons. First was all the money had to come out of pocket, which was for us. I'm a firefighter. Justin's a police officer. I'm not living on the easy street, so to speak, but it all came out of pocket. That was easier to do as an LLC. And then also for agencies that are purchasing kits, there was some concerns about nonprofit status, taxes, and things like that. Fast forward, and we believe we've worked all that out, but now we're at the point where we're still trying to recoup all of our investment. We're not making money off of this. I'm sure we could have priced the kits at probably $150, and yeah, we could have made money, but that's not the point. And I would have felt terrible. I mean, we're not here to make money off of children or those with autism. We're here to help. And transparency has been huge for us. We're as transparent as anyone wishes. Anything they want to know about us, we're happy to tell them. So we're currently in the process. We have a nonprofit set up through the Saginaw Community Foundation, which currently supplies replacement items for police, fire, EMS agencies. So as they use the items, they don't have to repurchase. Anytime they use, let's say, earmuffs, and then they aren't able to get them back, which we hope they're able to reuse them and clean them. But if they're not able to get them back, now they say, okay, well, do I need to purchase these again because I don't have the budget? Well, no, you don't. You contact us. We have this nonprofit. We can, assuming funds are in there, we can replace it. Now, we're currently working to get the entirety of Carter kits switched over to nonprofit status once the attorney gives the okay with all the issues I spoke about a little bit earlier. But for now, that's how we operate, is we have the nonprofit that provides these replacement items. It's worked well for us, and it works well for the departments that can't afford it.
Absolutely. And I think it's so cool that all I got to do is, let's say I have 6 ambulances in my agency and I want to put one on every one of it. So I got to buy 6 times 79. I purchased that. But when I use the stuff, you already have a foundation ready to restock that stuff for me as I use it. All I got to do is try to do the best I can to clean the gear that is reusable items that are in there, contact you if I need to replace the items that I need, and keep it going. So it's just maintaining the stock. There's no long-term cost. You just got to figure out a way to fund your initial setup. I think there's a lot of groups out there that are looking to be those angel investors for agencies that are trying to help targeted areas. And maybe anybody out there listening, even nationally, this is not just a Michigan thing. We talk about Michigan a lot, but it's really just because we have an example of things going on here, and we live in Michigan, and that's where we know our people that are happening. So these awesome human beings are available to you all over the nation. So this is not just some deal offered locally. In fact, Brandon, Justin, tell me, how many states are Carter kits currently making an impact?
Currently we are in, I believe it's over 20. I want to say 24 different states that has at least one Carter kid in it.
That's awesome. Now, Dr. Mishra, from an EMSC perspective, how did you kind of vet these guys out who just kind of show up? Now, what makes them, I think, awesome guys is their total lack of ability to be businessmen. That makes me trust them as first responders. Because if they're not trying to make a buck, I'm pretty sure they're doing it for the right reason, right? But you can't just go with that or your gut instinct. People's intentions can be totally good, but is it right for the program that you are the head of right now to help prepare EMS?
That is a fantastic question. So I want to take it back to actually how I met Brandon and how our conversation started, because those were the exact questions that I was curious about. I happened to meet Brandon at the exact right time because I was actually working on two projects. I was working on a project to help first responders get some education about autism spectrum disorder and how to interact with children who might be on the spectrum. But I was also trying to create a nonverbal card and create kits, sensory kits is what we were calling them, which is what Carter Kits is, because I didn't want to start from scratch, create a kit and create a whole training program. I knew I was in over my head. I had a group of subject matter experts. I had a couple families that volunteered to help me look over products that I found, look over training that we created. I had several individuals who had children with autism spectrum disorder. I also had some clinical individuals who were going to help. And I was starting to get this whole momentum going. And I met Brandon, and Brandon shared with me the story of Carter Kits, that it was designed by a dad with a son who has autism. And I thought that was fantastic because right there, that's a really good litmus test. I know he's not looking to go make a buck. He is looking to help children, help families, and help first responders. And if that doesn't hit on all of the cylinders that we need to hit, I don't know what does. But I had to take it a step further and do a little bit more research. So I was actually looking at several kits. I was actually starting to put them together myself because I wasn't finding what I needed. I was finding a lot of gadgets, a lot of toys, but they weren't hitting the mark of addressing the sensory differences that a child might have. So when Brandon went over the contents with me and explained why they chose each item and how Dr. Preen took her clinical neuropsychology perspective to each item to curate it, I knew we were on the right track. So once I got to meet with Dr. Preen and talk to her, go over these items and how they address hypo or hypersensitivities in children, I knew we were on the right page. Then I was put in touch with the state of Alabama EMS for Children program because they actually created an education program for their first responders, purchased kits, and did a study where they assessed providers before and after they received training and got the kits. And the response was overwhelmingly positive. It was literally a light and day moment, just like we've been talking about here. We went from providers and agencies feeling like they had absolutely no resources and no tools to feeling like they could advocate and lead the way. And that was my moment where I knew we were on the right track. And so from there, we developed the Michigan Autism training for first responders that's on my train so that it could be free for first responders so that they could get the education, and that I would do my best to help any agency or provider get the training and the tools to be able to communicate better and build that rapport so these children fare better when they have an emergency.
And to add value to that, I know American CME and the EMS on AIR podcast are working on more education to support that exact training that's on my train. We're going to have lots of modules just like it on various platforms so that people all over the world can benefit from that, because knowing is half the battle, like we said. Dr. Mishra, if I'm an agency in Michigan, all I got to do is contact you and or Carter Kits, and you're going to talk to them about this, and that's all they got to do.
Absolutely. Honestly, if you're listening to this and you're just saying, yeah, I know, I want autism training. I would like to have the right tools, but I also really want to know how to use them. Send me an email, phone call, text message. All my information is right there on the EMS for Children website, michigan.gov/EMSC. Try to make it easy to remember, because truly, I want to connect you to the resources that you actually want and need. And like Brandon said, We're here to help, and we're just trying to get you the tools that you need, but also the training. So at the end of the day, Carter Kids is fantastic because the contents are going to help build rapport. They're going to help soothe the child, and it's going to make outcomes better for you as the provider, for the child and the family. But it's not a bag of tricks. The bag doesn't just work by itself. Like we all said, if you don't have the training, you might not know why a flip toy is going to help a child who is screaming at you. You might not understand why a stretchy, weird tube looking thing is going to calm a kid who's crying. But if you do the training and you learn about how the sensory stimulus is perceived, you're going to be an expert relatively quickly. Like you said, Jeff, once you learn about why these items were chosen, you'll see them as a tool, not just a bag of 24 toys, which are also very fun to play with, may I add. But we're going to take it to the next step. It's not a bag of tricks. It comes with great training and a lot of peer-reviewed clinical evidence-based practice so that you're really getting the best information you can that's designed and curated by first responders for first responders. So we know we aren't going to miss the mark here.
Well, I almost don't want to ask because she put that so well, but Justin and Brandon, any closing thoughts?
Well, like she mentioned, and I've said it several times, it's just building that rapport. As I said with Carter, I know he specifically, if you tell him something, he does not forget it. He doesn't forget interactions. So when you have that high stimuli, when police and fire are showing up, the kids are going to remember it. So the next time we show up, we want that rapport. We want them to be able to come to us and know that we're there to help. So if it takes using one of these tools in this kit, that's what it takes. But you have to know how to use it. You don't want to give a kid the headphones when he can't hear. So you just need to be able to identify it, use this training, and know how to apply these tools.
Brandon.
Just wanted to thank all the agencies out there that have contacted us. We have about 500 Carter kits that are out there right now. And like Justin said, there's about 24 states. Yeah, it's a very small portion of our nation's first responders, but Rome wasn't built in a day, so to speak. And we're starting to make a dent here, and our hope is to continue to do that. But it doesn't happen unless there's that buy-in from those who are out there on the streets. And so I want to thank them for their effort and for their initiative to learn and improve in this area that is autism, because I think there's a lot we can do there for those that we serve.
This is usually where the show ends, but we have added some content that offers a bit more clarity and detail from a real expert on the subject. Allow me to introduce you to Dr. Ellen Preen, a clinical neuropsychologist and co-founder of Carter Kits. As a mother of a daughter with autism spectrum disorder, Dr. Preen brings an especially valuable perspective to the Carter Kits team. She has more than 13 years of experience in the clinical diagnosis and treatment of both adults and children with neuropsychological deficits, including autism spectrum disorder, trauma, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and psychiatric disorders. Unfortunately, Dr. Preen wasn't available in February when we recorded this episode, but we thought it was important to include Ellen's perspective in the American CME version. On July 30, 2021, Dr. Sam Mishra sat down with Dr. Preen for a brief interview. Her closing comments offer valuable clarity to autism spectrum disorder that may clue you into patients that require a nuanced approach to communication and care. Dr. Preen will be back in many more future episodes about autism spectrum disorder for first responders. Enjoy this additional segment.
Thank you for having me. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist. I have, I think, somewhat of a unique perspective on autism because I have a child. My daughter is 20 right now, 20 years old, and she has autism. And my work, I do a lot of autism-related evaluation. And I also did my dissertation, which is many moons ago, on autism as well. So I think that gives me, quite a different perspective on the personal, professional, and the research perspective of understanding of autism spectrum disorder. And of course, with my co-founders of Carter Kids, we came up with this idea. So thank you for having me.
What is autism spectrum disorder? Can you help us define this and make sure we're talking about this correctly?
So I think with the latest DSM-5, we talk about autism spectrum disorder. So I think the key word we need to be mindful of is the word spectrum. That means there is a plethora of symptoms within certain parameters that shows what autism is. So no two children with autism will look exactly the same, which is sort of the fascinating things about autism. But at the same time, there are many unique and core features of autism that these children have. But they may have different degrees of severity and frequency in terms of them displaying the core characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. So according to the DSM-5, the core features we're looking at really is a persistent deficit in the way they communicate and interact with people. So for example, we talk a lot about when the kids are younger and obviously moving throughout adulthood, there was a lot of turn taking, right? When you're talking, you say what you need to say, you pause, you wait for the other person to respond. For children on the spectrum, they tend to lack that ability. By that, I mean they may not understand the give and take of a conversation, specifically the turn taking aspects of it, and also the interest level of what they want to say. If they tell you what they want to tell you, they're kind of done. They're not that interested in what you have to say about what they're thinking. So sometimes they might come across as abrasive or rude or self-centered for that matter. Like, well, okay, you're done telling me what you want, but now let me tell you what I think. They would say, nah, I'm good. They're not trying to be rude, but to them is, I needed to tell you X, Y, Z. I did. Mission accomplished. And then the other piece that is more deficient in their communication is the nonverbal version. So a lot of times when we're talking, we don't realize we're doing it. We look at people in the eyes, right? Like right now, I know that we're doing this podcast, but I'm moving my hands a lot when I'm talking. You know, if I'm saying, oh, you know, when I was outside, I saw that palm tree, I might point at the palm tree if I'm near one. But children on the spectrum won't do that. They won't have the nonverbal communication behaviors that typically used by other people. They tend not to have it intrinsically. Now, they can be taught, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't come naturally to them, is what I'm trying to say. And then for them to develop, maintain, and understanding relationship from a social perspective, like making friends, engaging in play when they're younger, those areas are deficient. The other piece as a core features of autism spectrum disorder is that they will have a restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavioral interest. When they're younger, they might like to line up trains and line up cars. And if you disrupt that, they get very upset because you're disrupting their routine. In terms of their speech, they might do a lot of echolalia. So I understand there's a lot of information out there on the internet, but right now I'm going through the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. We can talk a little bit about what's outside the realm of the DSM, what's out on the internet in terms of how they define certain things. But when we talk about echolalia, we're really talking about repeating it verbatim, what they heard. For example, with a young child, if I ask my son, what do you want to drink? He would say, I want to drink milk. But for my daughter, if I say, what do you want to drink? And if she thinks she wants to tell me, yes, I want to drink something, she's going to repeat, what do you want to drink to me? So that's her way of saying, yeah, I want that, but not understanding. She's just repeating what I'm asking her, not really answering my question. And for them to use tenses, nouns, all that is quite difficult. If I say, do you want that? She might say, you want that milk. But really what she's trying to say is, I want that milk. But they may not know how to do that. But again, those things can be taught. They are also extremely rigid and inflexible in routine. That means when things are out of deviation, meaning if I say, okay, every day we go to school, but if something happens and you don't prep them ahead of time, they would have a lot of anxiety surrounding that disruption to their routine. They also have a lot of highly restricted, fixated interests. So again, they might be very, very fixated with Thomas the Train Engine. They might like other things too, but Thomas the Tank Engine will be the primary interest, and they would have everything and anything to do with that. They would want it. And also they might have a hypersensitivity or hypo. So hypersensitivity is over and hyposensitivity is under responses to sensory input. When we say sensory, we mean auditory, hearing things, tactile, feeling things, light, like it's too bright or not bright enough, noises, and a variety of sensory aspects of the environment that they are much more sensitive to.
Thank you so much. I feel like we're starting to really appreciate what you were saying. This is a spectrum, which implies that there's a great variety of attributes to be seen between children and individuals who are on the spectrum. And I think that's important for us to do as clinicians, first responders, because this isn't like there's a sign that's out there that says, hey, I perceive sensory input different, so you need to talk to me differently. We have a bit of a job to do as first responders and healthcare providers, individuals who are interacting with children and adults who are on the spectrum, to do a bit of hard work, which is to pay attention to how they're communicating with us or not, and how they might be feeling in circumstances that we are interacting with them, which can be challenging for anybody, but especially if we don't have the experience. One of the things I heard you mention that I thought was really critical is communication, since a lot of what we do is communicating our actions to individuals before or while we're doing them. Am I right in understanding that it's probably even more important for us to do that clearly and effectively when we work with somebody who might be on the spectrum?
Absolutely. So this is where I think a lot of times we say something, but we do not pay attention to what we're really asking that person. And most of us, like I said, who are not on the spectrum, will be able to read between the lines, read from your body language what you're really asking. But children on the spectrum don't do that. An example I can give you is if I ask my daughter if the phone is ringing and I'll say, can you get that phone? She might say yes and not move. And I'm going to say, hello, phone's ringing. I asked you, can you get the phone? She said, yes, I can. But think about what I just asked her. Can she take the phone? I didn't ask her, can you go and answer the phone for me? There's a big difference. So when you say, yes, I can, then also say, but I don't want to. See the difference?
Absolutely. So our communication will be critical. And I think one of the goals of this episode here is to make sure we have some takeaway points that we can do and consider when we're communicating and taking care of these patients. And I think that's a critical one, is being very clear and working with a child or individual to make sure we're communicating in a way that is effective and clear to that individual. So that's a really great message to take home here. I would like to get back a little bit to the background here on autism spectrum disorders, because I think this is another area that has a lot of misconception. I think we can do a bit here in this episode to clear it up. So Dr. Preen, can you help us appreciate a little bit more about the demographics surrounding autism spectrum disorder, who it affects, how it affects them, and also perhaps addressing some of those misconceptions about what actually causes autism?
Okay. So as of 2020, the Center for Disease Control reported there's about 1 in 54 children in the United States is diagnosed with autism. Okay. That is using the 2016 data because it just takes time for them to compile the data. It is much more prevalent in boys than in girls. 1 in about 34 boys is diagnosed with autism and 1 in about 144 girls diagnosed with autism. And boys are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed. The other piece is, sadly, autism does not discriminate. It affects across different ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups, and geographically. There's no preference over, Northern Hemisphere versus Southern Hemisphere. Doesn't make any difference. There are some risk factors that place certain families at higher risk of autism. I just want to be very, very mindful that a risk factor doesn't cause autism. Okay, a risk factor just means that you're much more at risk for it. And that has tend to do a little bit more with genetic factors. If you have a family member who has autism, it definitely increases the risk of other children in the family who has it. There's some data to support that the paternal age, the older the father is, the higher the risk. And in terms of what's causing autism, we don't really know, but we do know it's much more genetically influenced.
Thank you so much. And I think that really does help us appreciate that this is a topic that's relevant to everybody. Doesn't matter where you're practicing, where you live, where you work. We all have a chance to interact with somebody on the spectrum, and we can do our part to learn how to recognize those signs and do a bit of a change in our normal communication patterns to do better for those kiddos and those individuals. And to that effect, Dr. Preen, What would you like to say to some first responders who might be listening today to this episode? If there's a couple take-home key pieces of advice, maybe like a couple bullets that you would just really want to make sure that our listeners take home today when they're on scene, things are stressful, what are some of the things that they can look for to recognize that someone might have autism, and some key pieces of advice to communicate effectively and have some better outcomes?
I think that if you suspect, first and foremost, the individual has autism, I would err on the side of caution and just treat the individual like they have autism. Because if you go about it that way, we can cover our bases to make sure that the way we communicate to that person, we can minimize any room of error in terms of helping them understand what's going on. So a lot of times, I think it's very important for us, who is the person on scene or the provider, to be mindful of what you're saying. So if that person is not doing what I want them to do, I think we need to, like Brendan said earlier, if you take a pause and think, what am I really asking them? Am I clear in what I'm asking them? So one example I can give you is I thought about, sometimes when police come on scenes, they might tell a person to stand down, right? You and I know what stand down means. But for someone on the spectrum, that can be confusing. Because if you think about it, when you're standing, why would you be down? You wouldn't. You should be up. And what happens is children on the spectrum or individual on the spectrum, when they hear something that's confusing to them, they might actually approach you, meaning getting closer in physical proximity to get clarification. So imagine a scenario when the first responder says stand down, that person is approaching you to say, what do you mean by that? But you keep saying, stand down. You need to stand down right now. But they're still approaching you because they don't understand what you're saying. Or they might say, wait, if I'm standing, how do I be down? So you want me to be up or down? So this is what I'm talking about in terms of being more mindful of what you are asking. Then we can be much more effective in how we communicate. So typically be mindful also of analogies, more commonly used phrases may not have the same meaning to them. And also individuals, because I'm quite sure that you get calls responding to adults with autism as well, is be very mindful of the way they cope with stressors may not be the way you and I would cope or, handle any stress. So a lot of times they like to pace. Sometimes pacing is part of their repetitive behaviors. So they might pace back and forth to calm themselves down. So when you're asking him or her to stand still because you need to talk to them, it looks like they're walking away from you, but they're not. So if you start noticing they're taking just a lap, or just a walk, they are still listening to you, even though they may not make eye contact or they may not be standing or sitting right in front of you. So this is their way of coping. If you just sort of let them do their thing and don't see them as a threat, because that's not threatening behavior or an elopement, running away, that's very important. The other piece too is to check for clarification, right? You need to make sure what you said, they've actually understood it. And if there's any caregivers, family members around, always get their input. How does he or she function better? If they can help facilitate any communication, that would be very helpful because that's a familiar face for them. So I would use any tools in my book as much as possible under those stressful situations to get my message across. Because if there's any concern that the caregivers or the family members might be coaxing them, again, you will be there to ask the question. You can hear the caregivers and the family member asking the same question or relaying those questions. You will know how that is being relayed, and that's not going to change the individual's answers or responses to you. So taking cues from the caregivers would be very helpful.
That is all for the show today, everyone. Thank you for listening. And thank you to Sam, Justin, and Jason for coming on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope this episode helps drive awareness and preparedness for situations that include kids with autism and other special needs. Please keep emailing your questions, comments, feedback, and episode ideas to the EMS On Air podcast team by email at qi@ocmca.org. Also, check out our website, emsonair.com, for the latest information, podcast episodes, and other details. Follow us on Instagram at emsonair, and please, whatever podcast platform you use, subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and a review. Thank you for listening to the EMS On Air podcast. Stay safe and have a great day.